I'm Dr. Pil-yull Ra, PhD in political science. And I'm here to discuss how to resolve the Korean issues of reunification and denuclearization simultaneously. Perhaps a brief introduction of myself is in order. I used to teach political science and history courses at Longwood University in Virginia and at the Asian Division of University of Maryland in Seoul, Korea. I was also involved in the actual politics of South Korea as a congressional candidate and as a special assistant to a presidential candidate of South Korea. One of my primary interests as a political scientist has been the question of Korea's reunification. And I have published a book and a number of articles on this subject matter. I have 3 children who are all American citizens by birth, and I am blessed with 9 grandchildren. Currently, I live in the United States as a permanent resident. It is my firm belief, that the reunification of Korea is a historical inevitability. I believe what is impossible in the long run is not reunification of the Korean peninsula, but is continued partition. I'm presenting here my analysis of and possible resolution to the Korean issues of unification and denuclearization, in the hope that my thoughts may be shared among all the concerned people around the world, and that the American policymakers would one day be listening and act. There were 2 major nations, 2 nations that were partitioned in the aftermath of World War II. One was Germany and in Europe, and the other was Korea in Asia. Germany has been reunified in 1990, several decades ago already, and reunified Germany has become an economic powerhouse of Europe, one of the wealthiest nations in the world today. However, I'm deeply disappointed that Korea's reunification issue is still drifting in the air with no viable solution in sight after 7 decades of the nation's partition. Somehow it doesn't seem fair that Germany has been reunified peacefully, despite the fact that Germany was the main culprit of World War II, while there still is no prospects whatsoever for Korean reunification, although Korea was totally innocent of the war. Innocent Korean people have been victimized for such a long time by world politics, for which they are not responsible in any way. The pains of the nation's partition still continue, affecting every facet of Korean people's lives in a most profound way. Clearly, world politics of the post-World War II era made a terrible mess out of the Korean peninsula. And yet, I'm sorry to say, no world power responsible for it seems to really care about the cleaning up the mess they created. It may be because they do not know what to do about it, or maybe because they do not want to do anything about it for some reason, or maybe because they mistakenly believe the two Koreas are responsible for the cleaning up the mess. At any rate, it appears that the question of Korea's reunification has become a forgotten issue for now among the world powers, while the current North Korean nuclear issue has taken the center stage of international attention in the region. However, it is obvious that at the center of all the troubles in and around the Korean peninsula is the issue of Korean unification, and that without tackling and resolving that issue, we cannot hope to bring about lasting peace and stability in the region as a whole. As long as the peninsula remains divided, tension will persist in the region, and tragic incidents will continue to occur again and again and again. In fact, come to think of it, there has never been any true peace and stability in the region ever since the Korean partition in 1945. Perhaps the most notorious of all the tragic incidents that followed the nation's partition was the Korean War in 1950, which took a toll of millions of human lives and total destruction of the country. The victims, including Koreans, Americans, Chinese, and some UN forces, leaving everlasting scars and despair in the minds of millions of people affected by the war. The Korean War left thousands of Korean families separated between North and South Korea. Sadly, I have my own personal loss. One of my two uncles, who was a banker, simply vanished during the war and was never heard from again. The Korean War was not the only tragic incident that has taken place since the partition. In fact, there have been numerous tragic incidents since the Korean War. To mention just a few of the better-known ones, the American naval intelligence ship, the USS Pueblo, was hijacked by North Korean military forces in 1968. Burma's Rangoon bombing incident of 1983, which was clearly a North Korean assassination attempt against South Korean President Chun Doo-hwan while visiting Myanmar, killing 25 people in all, including 6 South Korean cabinet members. The Cheonan naval vessel incident of 2010, in which South Korean naval ship was torpedoed, allegedly by North Korean forces, killing dozens of South Korean sailors. And there have been many serious incidents involving North Korean armed spies infiltrating into South Korea for the purpose of overthrowing or destabilizing the South Korean government and society. All of these incidents are among the many, many sad consequences of the Korean partition. I should say that the current North Korean nuclear issue is also an unfortunate byproduct of the Korean divide. Certainly, the North Korean nuclear issue would be inconceivable apart from partitioned Korean peninsula and its unification issue and tension in the region. One must realize that North Korean nuclear issue is not the cause, but a symptom of the tension in the divided Korean peninsula. The two issues, that is, the issue of reunification and the issue of denuclearization, are inseparably intertwined, and in the final analysis, cannot be dealt with independently, because they share the same root cause, the artificial partition of the nation. This presentation is rather long and comprehensive, as it should be, for the basic reason that the Korean issues are critically important issues of the day, affecting the vital affairs of the entire East Asia and perhaps the world, and cannot be dealt with in a scanty and superficial way. The issues have to be looked into deeply and thoroughly if there is going to be any viable answer. I'm presenting here my thesis in 4 separate parts, so the viewers can watch them one by one at their convenience. The first 2 parts are devoted mainly to the background of the Korean issues, while the second 2 parts are devoted to solving the issues. In part 1, I will tell you about the origin of the Korean issues. I'm going to tell you about the little known and yet very important story behind the partition of the Korean peninsula involving American government. Actually the story is about a most regrettable act of American government that actually decided the fate of the Korean people in a worst conceivable way. I'm very sorry to say, when World War II was winding down. I'm sure that many American viewers, particularly the young viewers, will be very surprised, even shocked to hear it for the first time. In the second part of this presentation, I'll give my analysis of the nature and characteristics of the Korean issues from the perspective of world geopolitics, a point of view as never been discussed before thoroughly in the academic community as well as political community. Some viewers may be amazed to learn that, contrary to what many people might believe today, it is something other than the feud between North and South Korea that is ultimately responsible for the continuing Korean divide. In the third part of this presentation, I'm going to discuss how to resolve the Korean issues once and for all in a most plausible way without affecting the existing international balance of power in the region. And in the final part, my discussion will be focused on what role America can and should play in bringing about a successful conclusion of the Korean issues of reunification as well as denuclearization. Now I'm getting to part one, the origin, the hidden story behind the Korean partition. I'm going to tell you a little known and yet very important story behind the divide of the Korean peninsula. Many American viewers might wonder how the small and beautiful Korean peninsula stretched out like a long bridge between China and Japan became divided in the first place. After all, Korea's independence from Japan was twice promised by the Allied powers during World War II. First in the Cairo Declaration of 1943, and then again at the Potsdam Conference of 1945. Obviously, when the Allied powers were talking about Korea's independence then, they meant independence of the whole of the Korean peninsula as one political entity. No one then postulated two Koreas then. And yet, the Korean peninsula was divided into two parts, North and South Korea. What went wrong so that the Allied powers' promise for Korean independence as one nation state had to be broken? Well, something unexpected happened, which affected the fate of the Korean people in a worst conceivable way. It happened when World War II was winding down in favor of Allied powers. The American government under the Roosevelt and Truman administrations asked the former Soviet Union to declare war against Japan, despite the existence of a non-aggression pact of 1941 between Japan and the Soviet Union. On two very important occasions, toward the end of World War II, first at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, and then again at the Potsdam Conference in July the same year, the American President Roosevelt and Truman, respectively, asked the Soviet Union, then an ally, to declare war against Japan and participate in the Pacific War. And America promised that Kuril Island and Sakhalin Island, which were lost to Japan as a result of the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, would be returned to the Soviet Union as a reward when the war was over. Why would America want the Soviet Union to declare war against Japan when Allies were winning the war? And America had the atomic bombs that no other countries possessed. The reason was very simple and clear. The US government apparently believed that Japan would be pressured into surrendering sooner than later if the Soviet Union declared war against Japan, thus saving possibly thousands of American lives. But Joseph Stalin, then the Soviet dictator, did not respond immediately to America's request. He was adroitly waiting for the optimum moment, I suppose. And that moment came when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, instantly reducing the whole city to rubble. The Soviet Union declared war against Japan 2 days after the Hiroshima bombing, and the Soviet forces rushed into Manchuria and the northern part of the Korean peninsula. There was virtually no resistance from the Japanese army stationed in the region. Obviously, Japanese soldiers had lost the will to fight after the atom bombs. Soviet Union immediately after its occupation of the northern part of the Korean peninsula erected so-called the infamous Iron Curtain along the 38th parallel, thus sealing off the occupied area permanently, just as they had done to the Central and the Eastern European countries immediately following the German surrender several months earlier. It's no surprise that the very presence of the Soviet forces in the northern part of the Korean peninsula became the direct cause of the Korean partition. Once the Soviet forces occupied the northern part of the Korean peninsula, there was nothing that anyone, including America, could do to keep the Korean peninsula as one nation state. Consequently, several years later in 1948, two Korean governments were established in the peninsula, one in Seoul and the other in Pyongyang, each claiming legitimacy for governing the entire country. And this was how the two separate states of South and North Korea were born, with the support of America and former Soviet Union, respectively. One might wonder why 38th parallel became the dividing line. Here's a simple answer. America suddenly concerned that the entire peninsula might be occupied by the Soviet forces as they were pushing down southward, demanded that the Soviet forces do not advance south beyond the 38th parallel, and the Soviet forces would accept Japanese surrender above the line, while the United States Army would accept Japanese surrender below the line. Stalin did not dispute and went along with the American demand. The US forces arrived on the Korean peninsula about a month after the Soviet forces did. It is important here to point out that American victory over Japan had nothing to do with the Soviet participation in the war. but the Soviet military presence in Manchuria and in the Korean Peninsula turned out to be one of the most important factors in the successful communist takeover of the northern half of the Korean Peninsula, as well as mainland China. Mao Zedong's communist victory in 1949 over Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government was aided significantly by the Soviet military presence in Manchuria, thus making the majority of East Asia communist dominated. There is no question that the American request for the Soviet participation of war against Soviet declaration of war against Japan was a very serious diplomatic and strategic blunder. Anyway, this is how and why the peninsula nation Korea was divided into two parts, North and South Korea. With the artificial partition of the Korean peninsula, Korea became a crippled nation. I must say that a great injustice was done to the innocent Korean people and their nation by world politics, inflicting unbearable pains and miseries upon them. And the tragic story of the Korean people still continues with no end in sight. It should be considered one of the most ironic and tragic stories in the modern history of mankind. In closing this part, I have to say that although the fundamental cause for the Korean partition was the Cold War between the communist camp and the free world, that was just the beginning then. The direct cause of the Korean partition was the Soviet occupation of the northern part of the Korean Peninsula, which occurred because America invited the Soviet Union's participation in the Pacific War. Thus, Korea became one of the first major victims of ideologically polarized world politics between America and the Soviet Union in the wake of World War II.